Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the 2021 Scotiabank Toronto Waterfront Marathon Virtual Speaker Series. Today, we are joined by Mr. Bruce Kidd, one of Canada's most accomplished and influential runners. Bruce is an Olympian, a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education, and has won, frankly, more awards than I can count, including the Canadian Press's Athlete of the Year, the Lou Marsh Trophy, and inductions into the Canadian Olympic Hall of Fame and the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame. Today, he is joining us to talk about his adventures through decades of running and about his new book, A Runner's Journey. Welcome, Bruce. It is so nice to see you again.
It's so nice to see you, Kate, and thank you very much for that lovely introduction.
Well, again, it could have been far longer than that, but we want to talk about some of those accolades and some of your experience as we get into our conversation. But right off the bat, how are you? I mean, it's a beautiful day in Toronto on our day of recording, a little rainy, but warm. And I'm wondering if you've been out running or cycling today.
I was cycling this morning when it was overcast, but dry. And it's my favorite time of the year. And I mostly ride these days. My ankles don't let me run, but it's a great time of the year to be on a bike.
I think all about 4 months of the Toronto or Southern Ontario weather are great days to be on a bike and certainly to be out as a runner. So I'm glad to hear that. Bruce, I want to talk about this beautiful book that you've written. You call it a memoir, not an autobiography. You talk about what memoirs being a little more thematic, and this is your recounting of your years as a runner. And of course, they've been decades long and they're full of adventure. So you've divided this memoir into 3 sections. The first is the education of an athlete. The second is the education of an activist. And then finally, my struggle for Canadian sport. And all 3 titles are very compelling. So we want to get into all of them. But let's start with that first one. You really, in this book, you detail your love affair with running and with sports in general and how this started at a very young age for you. So let's start by maybe having you tell us about your early athletic years and how that kind of shaped your future.
Well, I always loved sports and I always loved to run. In fact, my earliest memories as a living human person is running. And it's always given me great joy. I didn't always think I was very good at it, but it was something I always loved to do. I loved running back and forth to school, which was about a mile away in those years. I loved running around neighborhood parks just for the joy of it. And it was not my first sport. My first sport was baseball. And growing up in the East End of Toronto, I played every sport that was available. But in grade 10, I lucked into discovering my ability for longer distances. It was a requirement of physical education that everybody run 1 mile in a course around Malvern Collegiate where I was a student. And I thought I jogged off the start, but very soon I was ahead of everybody. And a little bit later, the phys ed teacher encouraged me to go out for the intramural Harrier race, and the same thing happened. I thought that I was jogging, and very soon there was nobody with me. And so that led to thinking about distance running. And it's more complicated than this, and you can read about it, but I had a stint with my parents in Jamaica that winter, and bored, I ran around a large cricket field, imagining myself as John Landy, the Australian 4-minute miler, whom I saw at the 1954 British Empire Games. And I went further and further and further. And I loved that. We had other adventures in Jamaica, but what I most remember is discovering my own strength, being able to run further and further and further. And I came back and went into high school track and won both the 880 yards in the mile in my age category, and I was hooked.
And of course, so many of us can relate to our early experiences with mentors or, different types of motivation, our heroes who kind of inspired that in us as well. But you also talk in your book about your parents and their influence. I mean, you talked about them a little bit there in Jamaica, but you talk about your mom saying that you and your sister couldn't have streetcar fare since you were traveling was less than a mile, because of course you could walk or run that. I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit about your parents, the influence that they had over, especially your mother, the influence over her, or the influence she had on your physical education and your love just for, movement and being outdoors and exploring your city.
My parents loved sports too, both my mom and my father, and they encouraged all manner of physical activity, and they encouraged us to get to places on our own. And as I said in the book, I'm sure so I'm the eldest of five. My little sister, as I still call her, although she's a professor of communications at the University of San Francisco in San Francisco, she's 10 years younger than me. And the rule was that or it became the rule that my parents would not give us streetcar tickets if we could cycle there, or if Dorothy, my sister, could walk there. And I'm sure they trained her to go farther and farther and farther so that my mother could deny us streetcar tickets and we would have to walk too. And although it's a family joke, it does illustrate my parents really believed that, my mother believed that unless it was absolutely pouring rain, you should be outside during the day, running around and enjoying yourself. So they gave me this encouragement about physical activity. And this is a great family story too. Her older sister, my Aunt Dora, actually cycled from Toronto to Vancouver in 1926 on a single speed bicycle. So I had these influencers in my immediate family who relished in physical activity, in the joy of being outside, and were not afraid of covering distances.
What a fantastic story. And so my next question, so we've seen a real boon in running, especially, it's been years and decades in the making, and arguably there are more people running recreationally now than ever. And yet we see sort of a decline in our day-to-day physical activity in terms of how we approach our lifestyles. A lot of people drive. There's a real sort of sense of urgency to get to the next place. Have we lost some of that? I mean, do you think that there's something to be said for what you experienced as a child? And has there been a departure from that as a society? And is that a loss for us kind of collectively?
I think it's a huge loss. And there are very well done surveys in Canada and other countries showing the physical, mental health, pleasure loss as a result of that decline in physical activity. And it's been exacerbated because of the pandemic and the shuts down. With some exceptions, in some communities, in some cities, mostly middle-class communities, mostly affluent urban areas, there's been a rediscovery of the joys of physical activity. Bikes are impossible to get now because they were sold out. On many streets, you see kids cycling, tricycling, scootering, where before the pandemic, they weren't allowed to do that, but they have pushed and their parents have realized that. So it's a somewhat confused picture, but for the most part, already woeful levels of physical activity have just plummeted during the pandemic, with the associated decline in physical health, mental health, resilience. And the determinations are as complex. In my own sort of work in studying this in Toronto, a lot of it has been related to the unintended consequence of what were generally progressive changes in public schooling. The first of these in the 70s was the creation of consolidated school boards and large comprehensive high schools to provide students with far better education, because in larger, more comprehensive schools, you had labs, you had swimming pools, you had gyms, you had some teacher specialization, all of which was of benefit and raised the quality of education. But the cost of that was busing or mother's taxi or some other means of transportation. And I'm convinced, although I haven't done a really tight study of this, that there was a correlation with the first big fall in physical activity levels and that change in Ontario. Busing. In rural areas, it means that many kids no longer have after-school sport. They don't cycle, they don't ride their horses, they don't whatever. The second one in cities like Toronto was the creation of specialty schools, art schools, science schools, more open-ended schools, experimental schools, and the idea was that whereas in my generation you had to go to the local school, and you had to walk or cycle or go to the local school. Now in Toronto and in many other cities, you can go to the school you want with some restrictions anywhere in the jurisdiction. And so if it's an art school, you want to go on the other side of town, they encourage that, which is a good thing, except that it means more children's transportation and less physical activity on the way to school. Now, there are other changes. There are more screen time. There's been an increase in urban fear, which has kept kids at home. There's been a much more protective approach to parenting. So there are other factors too. All of these are motivated by concern for children, but they all forget the consequences of keeping kids at home, not allowing them to get from here to there on their own. A big cost to that.
So I want to come back to that in a moment and talk a little bit more about the concerted efforts around, not only promoting sports in our Canadian landscape, but also getting kids involved in participation. But before we get there, I want to go back a little bit to your story, because you identify as an activist. And again, we'll talk even more about that in the second section of your book. But in many ways, your activism started quite early in terms of challenging the misconceptions about both young athletes and Canadian athletes, especially Canadian runners on the global stage. Tell us about the Knights of Columbus meet in Boston, that indoor track meet when you were 17, and about what that event did for you in terms of not only the trajectory of your athletic career, but also about putting Canadian runners on the map.
Well, I was a smart-ass little kid in a lot of ways. And one of the ones is that I lucked into, training with older athletes and then racing older athletes. And it was a time when, and it's hard to believe this, but it was a time when it was feared that if a teenager ran longer than a mile, their hearts were going to stop, and they would be damaged for the rest of their lives. And so there was this this fear from both physicians and the general public that it was inappropriate to run long distances. My coach, Fred Foote, and my parents thought that as long as I was enjoying those longer distances and those longer workouts, and that they should do that. So I kept on moving up, and my story was teenager beats older athletes. It was thought that you didn't really succeed in distance running until your 30s. So I, in a series of races in Ontario, then in Canada, raced against much older athletes, with success. I got an invitation for this meet in Boston at the time on a Harvard recruiting weekend, and I sought to race the 2 miles. The meet promoter was totally opposed to me doing that, and only because Harvard insisted did he say I could run the 1 mile. And I said, no, I want to run the 2 mile. And Harvard leaned on this man, like really leaned on him to get me to run the 2 mile. So I was entered very, very reluctantly in the 2 mile. The 2 favorites for the race were probably 32, 33-year-old Pete McCardle and 37-year-old Fred Norris. Fred Norris had a son who was at the meet who was my age. And they were American British champions. They were celebrated names, and they were much older than I was. And in this race, I trailed them, put in a burst, and won a very tight, exciting race. Won in a time that was at that time only 2 or 3 seconds off the then world record for the indoor 2 mile. It was a breakthrough in many ways. It was a breakthrough for me in reading through the media coverage for writing this memoir, coverage that I kept but probably didn't thoroughly digest at the time. I realized that it had, people didn't say, "Oh my God, he's endangering himself," although they would for a few more years from time to time. But for the most part, they say, this shows that this prohibition or this restriction was nuts. And in the United States in particular, coaches started saying, why are we restricting our American athletes from running longer distances? And why are we relying entirely on international athletes, British athletes, Australian athletes, a few African athletes to represent our colleges in the distance runners? American boys and teenagers should be able to run these longer distances too. And it was quite extraordinary going back and seeing that this race in Boston validated that approach slowly. I mean, one of my clear memories, which is in retrospect something that brings me great pleasure, is going to a meet in San Francisco, and two young men, teenagers, came up to me in the lobby and said, "Can we talk about your training? We feel we're here to run the 2 miles. We're training the kind of mileage you did when you were our age, and people are giving us terrible grief. They're attacking our coaches. They're attacking our parents. They think that they're ruining our lives." And so we went up to my room, and I went through the whole, and I said, "How do you feel?" "Oh, we feel great." How do you feel after your workouts?" "Well, you're building recovery, all that kind of stuff. And so I said, just stay the course. Stay the course. One of them was Jerry Lindgren, and the other was Jim Ryan, both who went on at a very young age to become outstanding US Olympians. So that was one breakthrough. I think the other breakthrough was in Canada. And it's hard to believe, but I became a celebrity overnight. I became a symbol of Canadian nationalism, very quickly associated with that. And that became, I mean, obviously it started early. Everything starts earlier than you think this is the beginning point. But that was the beginning of probably my second and most important journey. And that is that people started asking me to represent youth, be a symbol for youth, and be a symbol for Canadian youth. And at first, and from time to time, I would resent that. I didn't start running so I would be the symbol of all Canadian youth. But, and it took me a while, and you read in the memoir some of the rough stages of this. But I gradually assumed that if I'm going to represent Canadian youth, I should speak for youth. And although I, didn't do any polling or surveying or talk to very many people, I had a kind of sense of osmosis of where Canadian youth were going. And I gradually, or at least I thought I did, I vainly thought I did, and I would gradually speak out. And I mean, it's hard to believe, but people gave me opportunities to do this. And I I took these opportunities. There was an annual one that I document because, again, there's lots of clippings. At the CNE, there was an annual Youth Day luncheon where all kinds of mucky mucks come to hear a speaker on the youth of today. So I was a speaker for that. And I told them there, about Canadian youth and that they should stop. They should let us be. They should let us do our. So I gradually assumed these roles. And as the 60s heated up and there were struggles over equity and access and so on, I began to speak on some of those things too. So Boston changed two things. I think, and I don't think I'm exaggerating this, it changed the North American, well, I would say the world approach to teenagers running distances. And secondly, it paved the way for me to learn about becoming a spokesperson for Canada and Canadian youth.
That's fantastic, Bruce. I want to, that's such a great segue. I want to talk about both of those aspects in my next question, because your activism is expansive. And when I think about the way that you not only spoke for, as you said, youth, I'm struck by the parallels between, there's being some concern about teenagers racing more than a mile and how hard that might be on their bodies. And the sentiments around women running. I mean, it's only been in my lifetime that women have been permitted to complete a full marathon for fear that they might either die or, it would do, irreparable harm to their reproductive systems. And so, I'm really struck by that comparison. And then you also talk about just advocating more for the Canadian sports system in general and kind of putting us on the map as a country globally when it comes to international competition. Your activism is expansive, and I know that it changed and grew as you got older and explored more of the world. You advocated for greater equity in the Canadian sporting system, especially around things like increased public investment and leadership and accessibility. I'm wondering how you feel about the progress we've made in those areas and what major milestones have yet to be hit when it comes to increasing all of those things that you hold so dear and that you've worked so hard for.
I would never say I'm discouraged, but I'm disappointed by the lack of progress we've made towards sport for all. We are rhetorically committed. We are legislatively committed to sport for all in the physical Activity and Sport Act, the Canadian legislation, but we've made very, very little progress, and almost all programs, whether they be federal, provincial, territorial programs, are directed on the high performance podium. And we assume that people will take up sport, but we provide crummy public facilities, very little insightful leadership. We make very few efforts to talk to kids and people from marginalized backgrounds about what they would need to participate. And it's very, very discouraging. There have been some things in my life that have really been setbacks, and that would be one of them. It's really quite, and today we have a pay for play culture. So the people who are, I like to say Bill Crothers and I got to the Olympics in public programs with the school, the municipality, the university, with a few exceptions. That would be impossible today. My friend Rick Bruno at Simon Fraser University, who does surveys on this stuff, has often said that Gordie Howe would never make the NHL today. I hope you can recognize his name. He was the greatest Canadian hockey player of my generation. And he was a poor Saskatchewan farm boy who was able to make it to the NHL and played into his 50s. And just a remarkable athlete and human being. But to excel in hockey now, you've got to have the equipment. You've got to be able to purchase a program to be part of. Your parents have got to drive you all over the universe. You've got to have sports schools, summer camps, and so on. And if you look at the class background of the NHL, Canadians in the NHL, it's totally changed over our lifetime. It used to be poor kids from the inner city, from the resource hinterland of Northern Ontario, from the rural areas of all provinces. And now it's middle class and upper class kids whose parents can afford to put them in hockey camps. So that's just one, for instance, of this. Bill Crothers has a school in Markham, that the Bill Crothers Secondary School, that is determined to provide those kind of opportunities in the public sector. But that's just one. There are a few others of those in Canada, but that's just one. There are foundations that provide assist, and I'm not opposed to them, but I also object to the fact that they deal with a few isolated cases, and they publicize in very expensive ads at the time of sport what a terrific thing they're doing. And what they're doing is fine, but they should be arguing for a full public accessible system for every child. And as one of my Black colleagues said, you can drive around Scarborough and you look at 10 and 11-year-olds and you see some fantastic athletes throwing a ball around, running a ball, and so on in schoolyards and parks. But very few of those kids last as athletes to when they're 13 or 14, when they really should be, turning to the kind of high performance training that we're doing and we know that teenagers can do.
Really well taken points, Bruce. I appreciate that. So, that touches a lot on sort of what we can do more as a country and how we can support athletes, of all backgrounds and of all sort of, classes and income levels within our own system. Of course, your activism, though, and anyone who reads the book will know this about you, extends far beyond our country's borders. I'm curious what it was about your international travels as an athlete that have inspired you to become a global sports advocate? Because, you know, many of the inequalities we see within Canada are far exacerbated around the globe. And I know that that's a torch you've really taken up. Maybe you can talk about your early experiences with global inequality within, you know, the sporting system and how that has inspired your current activism.
Well, my parents were internationalists, and I had an opportunity to think internationally growing up in that household. And then I got to travel around the world and intersect with athletes and coaches and journalists from other countries. I didn't keep to myself. I was a talkative little kid and I made a lot of friends. And one of the great things about track is that it's an international sport. And I could see, and this is a very moving part of my experience, I could see that there were people in other countries who raced against me fiercely, but felt like me in a lot of other ways. So I was, and that opened the door to my embracing the Olympic value of intercultural education and exchange. I really believe that sport, sport opens the way to every culture and ought to legitimize every culture. But it was, my journey to activism around equity started in Canada, you know, seeing the double standard by which my women teammates at the East York Track Club and U of T were treated, and in Toronto, and even though track and field was open to women, there were far fewer events and virtually no facilities. And you know, in the winter months, we trained in a heated dressing room with hot water, and our women teammates, we changed, and our women teammates changed behind a tree. So you could really see that, and gradually they would point out to other discriminations and so on. So that got me to, and then of course, I had a teammate, Harry Jerome, with whom I traveled a lot, and both in North American meets and then our national teams, we were very close. We had a ton of fun together. And he was treated just viciously so the double standard was very, very clear to me. But then when I got to, I'm not sure when the international one, but certainly I studied international poverty as a student. I had a gap year in India. I could see how difficult it was. And I could see that if sport for all really meant something, if the Olympic commitment to sport for all, it had to happen in rural India as well as happening in inner city Toronto. And I saw some amazing leaders trying to extend opportunities in rural India, and just became a fellow, an ally of them. That wasn't hard to do.
You just spoke about Harry Jerome, and I know that you and he built a really strong friendship together over the years that you were competing. In your memoir, you mention many other Canadian athletes who worked really hard to change the landscape of sport in our country and beyond. And again, Harry Jerome, you mentioned Jerome Drayton, Bill Carruthers, Abby Hoffman, several others. You write, "We sought to change the world and we did." And that's a really powerful statement. Maybe you can tell us more about that collaborative work of those sporting heroes and the concerted efforts to create those positive, long-lasting changes in our country and beyond.
Well, the late 1950s were a terrible time for Canadian sport. Whether you look at the medal tallies or other measures, whether you look at fitness measures, it was a very challenging time. And our generation aspired to put Canada back on the map in terms of So we didn't want to be just also rans all the time. You know, we wanted to be on the podium, and we wanted to, you know, break the records. So we wanted to do that athletically. And we all in different ways, or many of us in different ways, realized that it was more than just simply winning races. Oh, that was really, it was an early lesson that inspiration is not enough if you don't have the material conditions available. I mean, I argue with the COC right now who say the most important thing is exciting youth today to follow in the footsteps of these incredible champions. There's no doubt that those kids are inspired, but if they don't have facilities, if they don't have coaches, if the programs cost fees that they can't afford, if there's racism, it's not going to work. So we had to change the structure. And as you say, it took a while for us to learn, but we gradually, in our own way, and we had intense debates about the best way to do that, we gradually realized that we had to take advantage of fitness and amateur sport. We had to push governments in Ontario to provide better opportunities. And we did it. I mean, I don't think there was a sports minister in Ontario or Ottawa that I didn't write over the last 40 years. You know, there wasn't a commissioner of Parks and Recreation in Toronto that I didn't write or actively lobby over these things. And my teammates, comrades, many of them did the same thing.
You say in the book that you were misunderstood, that there were times, especially in your earlier years, where you were sort of seen as, you know, sort of beloved by one of two camps, but not fully, because you never really fit into either of them, either those who didn't like sports or, those who loved them, because you were so critical. You said that you loved sports and wanted to make them better, but you needed to be critical in order for that to happen. And I hear that in you now. I'm wondering, you know, I know you faced a lot of pushback because of that. And I'm wondering if you see any current athletes who are filling this role of the passionate critic, who are pushing for, both appreciative of, but also pushing for changes that are necessary to make our sporting system more equitable, more accessible. And if you don't see those athletes, why do you think that is? Like, do you see those passionate critics in any current athletes? And if not, why do you think that is?
I think there's a ton of them today. And it's so heartwarming and inspiring and moving for me to see athletes standing up for better conditions for other athletes. In the United States, there were a large number of women athletes who argued for abortion on demand a couple of days ago, for equity rights, for LGBT rights. The work that Stephanie Dixon is doing around not just Paralympic athletes, but persons with a disability generally. We've got some wonderful exemplars in both Canada and the United States, but it's been very recent. It's been very recent, and there was a generation, probably from the, one big change occurred in the eligibility rules in the 1980s when it became possible for Olympic athletes to endorse products. And when they won that right, they became, somebody persuaded them that they didn't want to upset the consumers, or they didn't want to set the sponsors. And many of them learned to bite their tongue rather than take on difficult issues. And that's only changed with Me Too, Time's Up, Black Lives Matter, and so on in the last 3 or 4 years, with a few exceptions. I mean, Mark Tewksbury has been a wonderful exception in this country. Stephanie has been a wonderful exception. There are, Jeff Adams, a wonderful exception. There are others that I'm blanking on that I wrote in my book, but for the most part, it's only been in the last few years that that culture has changed, where the idea of being a role model meant speaking out on sport issues and public issues. It's a welcome change.
And it's something I'm sure we'll see a lot more of. And I'm sure you, as I do, feel that that's necessary, and hopefully it will continue. So again, we thank you for all of the work that you've done to advance sport within this country and beyond. You, Bruce, have had so much success as an athlete yourself. You know, an Olympian, you know, a Commonwealth Games gold medalist. You traveled the world. You had so much success from a young age all the way through the end of your career. Of course, running and competition have looked a lot different over the last year and a half. And as a runner yourself, as our athletes head into their virtual races this month, what advice do you have for those trying to complete their virtual races and just get the best out of themselves in what have been incredibly challenging circumstances around COVID-19?
Boy, it's really, really hard. My partner, Phyllis Burke, has run several virtual races and has had very little appetite for them. She's regarded them as training runs or time trials and run mostly with teammates. She so misses the competition, you know, you can race against the clock, and that's from time to time, but the glorious improvisation that is a race, where you throw in a burst and someone counters and other people come and you're running in a group and they all pull you, and it changes where every race is a different adventure. Nothing can replace that. And I grieve for runners who don't have that. I'm sure a lot of us wouldn't have pursued running to the extent that we did if there wasn't racing as well as running. I know there were people who were feared racing or were nervous about racing, but most of us love being in a field and going back and forth and all. That is, I call them glorious improvisations. I always learn from myself in those races, and I learned about other people. I sure hope that with the campaign for double vaccinations and with the other safeguards we're introducing, we can regain that for everybody who loves to run. You know, whether you're at your level, Kate, or a 4-hour marathoner, there's nothing like being in a race.
Just to be clear, that was glorious improvisations, Bruce?
That's how I think every race is.
I love that. I love that. I think that's wonderful. You can learn all about Bruce's glorious improvisations in his own running career, as well as a history of running in Canada, and frankly, Bruce, a history of, you know, Canada itself. I mean, you go through so many of the advances in technology and society and politics that sort of influenced not only your running, but your activism in your new book. The book is A Runner's Journey by Bruce Kidd. It is available at your local bookstore or online. It is a wonderful memoir. I could not put it down. Can't speak highly enough about it. Bruce Kidd, thank you so much for speaking with us today for this virtual speaker series. We really appreciate you taking the time, and we wish you the best of luck with all of your upcoming cycling adventures or whatever else you have on the horizon.
Hey, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I love this. It was a very enjoyable conversation, so thank you very much for that. And good luck.
Always a pleasure.
Congratulations.
Good luck to everyone racing this weekend and beyond.